Get Rich Education is brought to you by Ridge Lending Group, Apartment Investor Mastery, and Producers Wealth.
You're listening to the show that has created more passive income for people than nearly any show in the world. This is the powerful Get Rich Education.
Welcome to Get Rich Education, episode 192. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Yes, you are back where you belong. You are in that abundant place where financially free beats debt-free. Well, today we're talking about freedom and free markets as we discuss rent control and some real estate investing problems today. Now, you, as a real estate investor, generally operate in a free market. You more or less pay market value for a property when you buy, and then you rent the property to a tenant for a number of years, typically at market rent, and at the rent amount that the market will bear. And then down the road, you'll sell the property for something near a market value price. Well, we're going to talk about when an outside force comes in and disrupts all of that for you that I just described. Now, first, let's look at intended versus unintended consequences and the economy that you live inside, and what is seen versus what is unseen. It is from Henry Hazlitt's Broken Window Fallacy in Economics, which is different, coincidentally, than when our guest last week brought up the broken window theory from psychology. A young hoodlum heaves a brick through the window of a baker's shop. The shopkeeper runs out furious, but the boy is gone. Well, a crowd gathers on the sidewalk and they begin to stare with quiet, almost satisfaction at the gaping hole in the window and the shattered glass over the bread and pies of the bakery. After a while, the crowd feels the need for some philosophic reflection, and several crowd members are almost certain to remind each other, or even remind the baker that just had the loss, that, you know what, after all, this misfortune does have its bright side. At least it will make new business for some window fitter when they come out to replace the window. The crowd begins to think of this as they elaborate upon it. Well, how much does a new plate glass window cost? $800? Well, that's a fair bit for the baker to have to pay. But after all, if windows were never broken, then what would happen to the glass business? And then, of course, this thing is endless, okay? The onlooking crowd rationalizes that, hey, this thing really isn't so bad. The window fitter will then have $800 more to spend with other merchants, and then those in turn will have $800 more to spend with still other merchants, and so on ad infinitum. The smashed window will go on providing money and employment in these ever-widening circles. So the logical conclusion from all this would be, if the crowd did draw one, that the little hoodlum who threw the brick that broke the baker's window, that person's far from being a public menace, but really a public benefactor. Well, now, wait a second. Let's look at this more closely. The crowd is at least right in its first conclusion. This little act of vandalism will, in the first instance, mean more business for some window fitter. Yes, the window fitter is really no more unhappy to learn of this incident than an undertaker is to learn of a death. But look, here's what no one considers. The baker, the shopkeeper there who had his window broken, he will be out that $800 that he was planning to spend for a new suit of clothing. Because he has to replace a window, he will have to now go without the suit or just some other equivalent need or luxury. So instead of having a window and $800, the baker now merely has a window. Or as he was planning to buy the suit that very afternoon, instead of having both a window and a suit, he must now be content with the window and no suit. If we think of him, the baker, as part of the community, well, the community has lost a new suit that might otherwise have come into being and is just that much poorer. So the window fitter's gain of business, in short, is merely the suit tailor's loss of business. No new employment or productivity has been added here. The people in the crowd, they were thinking only of two parties to this transaction, the baker and the window fitter. They had forgotten the potential third party involved, the suit tailor. They forgot about the suit tailor precisely because he just never enters the scene. It will never happen. And they will see the new window be replaced there in the next day or two, but they will never see the extra suit precisely because it's just never going to be made. They only see what is immediately visible to the eye. That is called the broken window fallacy. Anybody, one would think, would really be able to avoid falling into that fallacy after a few moments' thought. But yet the broken window fallacy, under 100 different disguises, is probably the most persistent in the history of all of economics. It's probably even more rampant now than at any time in the past. Now, that tale is from Henry Hazlitt's classic, fantastic, 1946 published book called Economics in One Lesson. And that 70 or 75-year-old tale, that is as relevant today as it was then. In fact, I just read the book not long ago after I had been hearing about it for so long. It is still relevant stuff. In the newer edition that I read was reprinted with a foreword written by Steve Forbes. Okay, well, what takeaways can you really apply here from the broken window fallacy? How can we apply that to real estate investing? Well, in your economic life, it's easy for you to disregard the opportunity cost of not doing something with your money. People just don't consider what could have happened and just never did happen. One great example is with the 15-year fixed amortizing loan versus the 30-year. You might say with the 15-year loan, and you might be able to see on paper that you would save $300,000 in interest over the life of the loan versus the 30-year. And some people only look at that and they think, oh, well, that's it. The 15-year must be better. But what is not commonly considered is that the 15-year loan's payment, which is, say, $750 greater than the 30-year loan's monthly payment. Well, what if you had instead invested that $750 per month rather than paying a loan down? That's $9,000 per year toward yourself buying more property. Every 2 years or so, you could buy another property with that money. You would probably be substantially better off doing that rather than just trying to save money again. And by the way, I just made up the numbers there for a quick example without opening amortization tables. So my point is the 15-year versus the 30-year mortgage thing, that's often like the Hazlitt broken window fallacy present in your life again today. Now, where real estate investing meets economics, one place that you can apply the broken window fallacy is to rent control. Yes, rent control, where a government agency limits the amount of rent that you can charge your tenant. The government caps the rent. Say there's a $2,500 ceiling that you can charge per month in rent for a unit that you've got. Well, first of all, let me ask you, what incentive to improve the property do you now have if your rent is up to that ceiling and market rent exceeds the ceiling? What impetus do you have to provide any good service to the tenant if your rent income gets capped? Remember, we want to do well here at Get Rich Education. We want to do good in the world, provide people with clean, safe, affordable, functional housing. Now, today in the United States, New York has the longest history of rent controls. It's been around since 1943, and not like everywhere in New York. It's mostly coastal areas that have high tenant populations. Oftentimes they correlate with more urban areas that have a history of rent control, and they are generally the areas we avoid investing in here at GRE. Other places where rent control remains in effect includes Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, California. A bunch of smaller communities also have rent control, like some California cities, Santa Monica, Berkeley, West Hollywood, and a number of smaller towns in New Jersey. In recent years, rent control in some cities has been ended by state referenda in places like Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just about all of those areas are places I don't recommend investing in anyway because they generally happen to coincide with areas that don't cash flow, and those same areas seem to be where other laws give the upper hand to tenants rather than landlords. Now, I don't know if you in your life have ever made small talk with baristas that work inside Manhattan coffee shops, but I have, and you'll find what I've found. None of the baristas that work in Manhattan can afford to live in Manhattan. They live in some other low-cost New York City borough or over in New Jersey. And now you might think that rent control would be better off for society. That way, lower paid workers like coffee baristas could live close to where they work, and you would have a better mix of people there, and that's better for society. Well, that might be true in the short term. But let's look at the longer term effects for the whole of society, which has more consequences than just one group in the short term. Again, those effects that are unseen and often not considered. The effects of rent control become worse the longer that the rent control continues. New housing might not even get built because there isn't any incentive to build it, okay? It just isn't economically feasible to build new housing since you would not want to invest in it yourself because as an investor, you could not get market rent for it. With increases in building costs, commonly as a result of inflation, the old level of rents will not yield a profit. What often happens is the government finally recognizes this problem, and then, and only then, do they exempt new housing from rent control. That's the only way that they'll build new housing once they realize this. But then, you know what? That doesn't work either because, see, there is still not an incentive to do much new building when the older buildings still have rent control in place. That's because rents for new housing, they might get to be 3 times, 5 times, or even 10 times as high as rent in equivalent space in the older rent control properties. Yes, this actually has happened in history many times before. Then, under such conditions like this, existing tenants in old buildings, they're still grandfathered in under rent control. Well, they just simply won't move. They don't want to move because they're only paying maybe 20% or 50% as much rent as those in the newer non-rent controlled places are. So those grandfather tenants with the low rent control rent, they won't move no matter how much their families grow or their existing accommodations deteriorate. And their existing accommodations do deteriorate because, again, as an investor yourself, you have zero incentive to improve or maintain the property if you're receiving far below market rent in a rent control scheme. Plus, those tenants in old buildings that have that sweetheart deal because they're protected from rent increases, just say their families contract, they shrink in size. Well, those tenants that live in rent control, they still don't want to move out, so they'll just waste the extra space. Well, then wasted space, especially in an urban place, that'll concentrate the demand on the relatively few new buildings. So what that then does is force those new building rents to become substantially higher than they would have been reached in a completely free market. So now you have space across cities being used really inefficiently. Some people are paying unfairly low rent, and other newer residents are effectively subsidizing the old rent control renter with their unfairly high rents. And soon, vast sections of a city have residents that tolerate housing conditions that most would consider intolerable repair. The roof leaks, the air conditioner doesn't work. Well, the landlord has little incentive to fix it. If rent control lasts long enough and you're a property owner, it can even get to the point where you have these mounting and compulsory losses. That's because you now own dilapidated places that you have no incentive to remodel, let alone even want to fix a leaky roof. The rent income that you're getting is so low compared to all of your other expenses inflating, and you might soon find that you cannot even give your property away. Some landlords of rent control properties have even abandoned their properties and tried to just disappear so that they cannot be held liable for taxes. So now you've got owners that aren't supplying heat or other basic services to tenants any longer. Then tenants are compelled to abandon their apartments. Windows get boarded up to prevent vandalism. Arson actually can become frequent. And a lot of times the owners of the units are suspected of the arson. So now you can have blocks of abandoned apartments, neighborhoods that have become slums, and next, the city's tax base gets substantially eroded. In a worst case scenario, if rent controls stay in place long enough, all of this can happen. So there's a lot to consider here on both sides, but just keep in mind that helping the coffee shop barista get more affordable housing in the short term seems like a nice thing to do, but over the long term, wider society often suffers under rent control. Rent control encourages wasteful use of space. It discriminates in favor of those who already occupy houses or apartments in a particular city or region at the expense of those newcomers or those who find themselves on the outside. So it constrains society's mobility. So if you would just permit rents to rise to the free market level, that allows all tenants or would-be tenants equal opportunity to bid for space. And if rent control were just called by a different name, like government price fixing, which is what it is, well, then maybe it would be denounced more often than it really is. So the message is that where real estate investing meets economics, consider the cost of an action with the unseen opportunity cost of an inaction, going back to the broken window fallacy. And, this is just one more reason why we generally focus on cash flowing U.S. real estate markets in the Midwest and South. They're landlord friendly. There's neither a history of nor an imminent threat of rent control in these places, and just so many other reasons why we focus on these more stable regions. So again, that book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, it's a book that I think so much of because it's really thought-provoking, and it has made an Elite 8 list of recommended books, all of which you can find on our website at getricheducation.com/read. I don't think that Henry Hazlitt is a well-known name, but it's a pretty well-known book, and it has a number of intersections like this between real estate and economics. Check that out and all of my recommended reads again at getricheducation.com/read. We've been talking about big picture problems here. Next, let's talk about your personal finance and real estate investing problems that might be affecting you and your properties right now, and you might not even know it. And one is even a reminder that comes from an accident that took place in one of my own income properties. I'll share that with you next. You're listening to Get Rich Education. For an income property investor like you that needs an income property loan, go to Ridge Lending Group. And over the years, you've heard owner Chaley Ridge generously give her time to you right here on the show as a guest. Ridge provides investment property loans in almost every U.S. state, and you're going to find out how they've helped more Americans realize their dreams of financial freedom through real estate than any other mortgage lender in the entire nation when you get started at ridgelendinggroup.com. MC Lobsher is the host of the top-rated business and investing podcast, Cash Flow Ninja, and also the president of Producers Wealth. Producers Wealth assists people in creating, protecting, and perpetually multiplying wealth in any economy through creating processes that help them increase their production, provide them with liquidity, passive income generators, and opportunities for enormous growth. Learn more about their time-tested and proven systems at yourownbankingsystem.com.
This is the Real Wealth Network's Kathy Fettke, and you are listening to the always valuable Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. Before I go back to discussing some real estate problems today, we've had some pretty interesting developments in the real estate investing world these last few weeks. President Trump repealed some of the Dodd-Frank Act, and the threat of Trump tariffs is becoming even more and more real. Much like rent control, tariffs are not free market either. That puts up barriers to trade. Richard Duncan told us about 2 weeks ago that tariffs can be inflationary. I might get a chance to talk to you more about Dodd-Frank on a future show. One guest you're going to want to hear on an upcoming show here in the next few weeks is rather interesting. Okay, decades ago, one Pennsylvania man was doing some very close reading of the IRS tax code, and he deduced that Section 401k of the code could effectively serve as a sort of retirement savings plan for employees if it were utilized in a certain way. And soon the 401k would become a household name and revolutionize the way that people save for retirement. Well, that man's name that made that discovery is Ted Benna, and he is now credited as the father of the 401k, even the inventor of the 401k. Well, Mr. Benna is going to be here on the show with us. He has lamented himself that 401ks ought to be blown up, that they've been fraught with hidden fees and more. My main problem with 401ks is that they don't start paying you income until you're in your 60s and 70s. Well, Ted Bennett will be here on the show soon to tell us about it. But I want to talk to you more about, more problems today. Now, it's nice when things go well and you are enjoying the 5 ways that real estate simultaneously pays you. But, problems are really where we get the lessons. Not long ago, I got an email from one of my property managers about an apartment building that they managed for me. And what happened was just one of the dumbest things a tenant has ever done in one of my properties. Probably the dumbest in all these years. I still don't know how it happened, but in apartment 17's tenant bathroom, they left the sink drain plugged while the faucet was kept turned on. And the tenant left the property for the day with the faucet still running. Well, soon the poor tenant in the apartment down below them, unit 13, started complaining that water was running down from the ceiling. And that's when my manager got access to the unit, saw the plugged up sink drain, and stopped the bathroom faucet. When they told me all about it later, that's what had happened. Well, flooring was water damaged and curled up. I saw the photos. Drywall was damaged. Fixtures had to be removed and replaced, and it was somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 worth of tenant damage. And yes, this stuff happens to me. Just because I've been investing for a long time doesn't mean I'm exempt somehow from this kind of thing, of course. Well, you know what? I consider myself kind of lucky on this one in the end. The tenant down below that was affected from the upstairs unit's flood and their mistake, that poor tenant was very accommodating and just stayed at a friend's place. The tenant that screwed up and left the faucet on was actually a pretty responsible person. I still don't know how the accident happened. I was hoping that the tenant was going to be financially responsible enough to pay for the damage that he caused. I didn't want to have to be on the hook for it. It was not my fault. But you know what? I didn't have to worry about it because that tenant that made the mistake had renter's insurance, and renter's insurance ended up covering most or really pretty much all of the remediation. So now, even though it was my tenant's fault, if they couldn't come up with the 10 or 15K, I might have been on the hook for the damages, even if I had to take them to court for damages. Sometimes you couldn't collect. But that tenant was responsible enough to have renter's insurance. So the lesson and the question that I have for you is, do you require that your tenants have renter's insurance? And if you don't, then why don't you? Some landlords put it right into the tenant lease that they've got to have that. And renter's insurance is provided by, many of the major insurance companies, company names that you're used to hearing. And it is really cheap. It's really inexpensive for a tenant to buy it. Maybe $10 or $15 a month. That is it. And renter's insurance provides coverage for a policyholder's belongings, liabilities, and possibly even the living expenses in case a place is rendered uninhabitable for a while. And it looks like in this case, it even covered damages to the tenant's unit down below, the innocent party that was affected by the flood. I was like $0 out of pocket. There's just like an email going back and forth in my email inbox every once in a while when I need to see these photos that aren't very nice to see, but it was a lot better than me having to be there or deal with it again. I didn't lose on my return on time invested. Those activities are outsourced to my manager. So that is renter's insurance. And when the flood remediation work was done, I saw the photos and the replaced areas, and they actually look nicer and newer than it did before the flood took place. And stuff like that often happens with insurance claims. I kind of feel like I made out. Now, way back in episode 72, Cassandra Boltman was here with us on an episode called How to Manage Your Property Manager. You might remember that one. I recently interviewed Cassandra again in a video format on our Get Rich Education YouTube channel. I hope you're watching me on the GRE YouTube channel. We'll play the audio from that video here as I ask Cassandra about another landlord-tenant related problem that can be headed off if the lease is written properly. This clip is about 2 minutes long. Cassandra, you deal with an awful lot of landlording issues. A lot of times that's where the friction takes place. You had an interesting story recently with how to handle security deposits and rent. Tell us about that.
I wanted to make sure I shared this with your listeners because it's the one thing that can actually increase your revenue without adding too much expenditures to your side of the account. So check with your property manager. and ask them, if a tenant gives a 30-day notice, do they require that the tenant still pay last month's rent or use the security deposit to pay last month's rent? Because if they use the security deposit, pay last month's rent, then you can't charge them the damages and get it from their security deposit. And then it leaves a balance that you never collect as a landlord. So if you flip that around and make sure your property manager charges last month's rent, actually collects last month's rent and uses the deposit for damages, then you're going to increase your revenue. So a story we had was a guy was consulting with us. He had 50 units. When we did the math, it was around $13,000 in lost revenue on security deposit stuff over a course of a year because we couldn't charge the security deposit because it was already spent on rent. And we couldn't go after them in collections because collections wasn't even done. So double check the processes with your property manager. Just that alone will increase your revenue.
Now, is that something that an investor would usually expect to see in the lease agreement, that the security deposit shall not act as a last month's rent?
In some states, you do want to make sure that's in there, or you can't actually apply it that way. So you do want to check your state, and you do want to ask. Some states, it's not even a thing. Some states, it's a mandatory issue. But you really want to check the procedures that your property manager is using, not, I assume my property manager's doing it. Because a lot of people would think the property manager is enforcing the max collection on rent. But not all of them do because they get lazy or busy or don't have enough staff or they're focused on sales and not property management. So you always want to check.
Right. You want to make sure your manager is not focused on making their job easy, but they're looking out for the investor, for you first. You can learn more about Cassandra at thelandlordsalmanac.com. So yes, look into renter's insurance for the tenant. And then, like Cassandra discussed, at move out, be sure that the tenant has to pay the last month's rent as separate from the security deposit. I think most any competent manager has that one down. Any competent manager is going to have a lot of this covered for you in the lease already. And, you know, so much of this is about you avoiding mistakes as a real estate investor. If I can help you avoid mistakes, you're going to be more profitable. And all of this beats investing in stocks and mutual funds. And when you're losing there in those vehicles, you often don't even find out about it because it's buried under layers of management and hierarchy and dilution. Over the long term, returns from stocks and their derivatives are about zero when you factor in inflation, emotion, taxes, fees, and volatility. So we've been talking about real estate problems today, opportunity cost, rent control and economics, and then exposing weaknesses in some leases and places to help you prevent loss. And if this happens to be your first time listening to the show, don't be discouraged. Like I like to say, real estate, that's what's made more ordinary people wealthy than anything else. We talk about how to optimize that here. And some of these tips are really just to help you make better profits on what is hopefully already a profitable venture for you. Well, with problems behind us now, let's talk about some really dreamy real estate. Let's meet in person, you and I, in Placencia, Belize, like we talked about several weeks ago. Yes, this slack-jawed podcaster with loafers on is soon going to be a slack-jawed podcaster with sandals on. You've heard me on the show for a few years now, so let's turn that around and let me be your listener. Come along, enjoy a great place, and tell me your thoughts and your challenges and your big wins. And why Placencia, Belize in the tropics? Well, it starts with underpriced real estate and an opportunity for you there. And why else? Well, diving and sunbathing, snorkeling, sea fishing, beach combing, jungle trekking, cave tubing, wildlife from scarlet macaws to jaguars, Mayan ruins, and an opportunity to buy real estate at prices like you would have been able to buy at in Hawaii in the 1950s before Hawaii had its massive real estate run-up. When you're there in Placencia, you might feel like you've entered a time machine and gone back in time. When Robert Kiyosaki first landed in Belize, he said, "I didn't know a place like this still exists." Now, like I've told you before, I've traveled extensively in Hawaii, Oahu, Maui, Kauai, the Big Island. And in Belize, the water is warmer than Hawaii, and it's closer to most of the U.S. than Hawaii. You see, Placencia is not a mature market yet, like much of Hawaii is, and much of the mainland U.S. is. Now, mature markets, well, that's great if you happen to live in one, which you probably do. because you have plenty of amenities and infrastructure in your hometown that you probably just take for granted, from a bridge that you cross over on your way to work to public parks with fountains. And, then there just really isn't as much upside growth and new value creation potential there as there is in an immature and less developed place like Placencia, Belize. From mainland condos and even private islands, all with a world-class builder, you can invest for both cash flow and lifestyle at the same time and in a turnkey fashion in Placencia. And this is all within a stable English-speaking nation close to the U.S. with government officials supportive of development. And the Belizean currency is pegged fixed at 2-to-1 to the U.S. dollar. So you have currency stability as well. And it really is just an amazing confluence of circumstances. And that's why I'm happy to tell you that I'm going to Placencia twice this summer. Now, the first investor tour, July 20th to 23rd, quickly sold out. So that's why I'll be returning to Placencia for the September 6th to 9th investor tour. And at last check, there are still some slots available for that September 6th to 9th tour. So I hope to meet you then. And groups are limited to 20 people. So we're going to get to hang out together and get to know each other better. The 4-day, 3-night tour price is really low. The provider is basically doing this at their cost. It includes your 30-minute round-trip flight from Belize City down to Placencia, transportation, meals, and even taking a boat out to these private Belizean islands. Oh, man, so dreamy. As a real estate investor, you've got to be concerned with your numerical return on investment, no doubt. And this is an investing show. Look at your cap rate. Look at your cash-on-cash return. But just as often, you've also got to ask, what is my return on time invested? And what is my return on life? If you want to meet there, grab a tour spot. You can get started at getricheducation.com/Belize. There's a great report that the provider has put there for you so that you can read more about it before deciding if you would like to come on the tour. And there is no such thing as hard selling on the tour, or I wouldn't even be talking about this. It is informational in nature, although there are opportunities to buy real estate there. You're just going to find those days really enjoyable and easygoing. And, consider too, you might find the most value that you're going to get to meet other couples and other individuals on the tour, a lot like you, a lot of them that listen to Get Rich Education. Let's meet in person. That starts for you again at getricheducation.com/Belize. Signing off, I am Keith Weinhold, and I am here every week to help get you thinking about things that you probably haven't thought about before to help you build your wealth. We'll see you next week. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
If you want to retire in 5 years or less through real estate investing, then pay close attention as I'm about to share my proven recipe with you. This is Brad Sumrock, and I've taught thousands of people just like you how to replace their incomes, quit their jobs, or simply have more income and freedom than they ever thought possible. And we do this by investing in apartment buildings. After starting with no experience, I managed to pocket over $1 million in cash and retire from my 17-year corporate job after only 3 years of apartment investing. And I have hundreds of successful students that have had similar results. If you want to get out of the rat race or simply have more income and freedom in your life, then investing in apartment buildings might be the answer for you. Visit our website at bradsumrock.com to get more information about our upcoming training events. That's bradsumrock.com.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.